Amy Tompkins, and I'm a member of the Arts and Humanities Commission here in Takoma Park. Thank you for joining us tonight for Linda Rabben's Sanctuary Stories lecture. It's just one of our many free We Are Takoma events scheduled for this summer. Tomorrow we have a one-man Spanish play, and then on Sunday we have the Pump House pop-up. And you can check out our full range of events and exhibitions and the like on the Takoma Park website and then on the We Are Takoma Facebook page. Tonight, Linda will explore stories of sanctuary throughout history and analyze the current political debate over sanctuary cities. Linda is a longtime resident of Takoma Park, an associate research professor of anthropology at the University of Maryland, and a human rights activist. She has followed and written about migration issues for 20 years. Her latest book, Sanctuary and Asylum: A Social and Political History, was published in 2016. Linda, take it away.
Can everybody hear me? Yes? Okay. I usually say if 3 people come to a lecture, it's a success. So thank you for helping to make this lecture a success. We'll start the slides. And these are just images with, well, doesn't seem to work. So I'll go ahead and read some stories, and I brought along a friend who is going to tell her story at the end. Sanctuary is a very ancient institution. It goes back perhaps hundreds of thousands of years, I believe, as long as human beings have been talking, and maybe even before we started talking, we were giving refuge to strangers. And by the time the first story that I'll read happened, it was already an ancient institution. This comes from the Roman Empire in the 1st century AD. Behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Rise, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you. For Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him." And he rose and took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. "Out of Egypt I called my son." So this is, in the Western Christian tradition, this is the first sanctuary story. But people could trace sanctuary at that time back to the Egyptians, maybe 2,000 years before, if they were looking for where the tradition came from. The second story comes from Arabia in the 7th century CE, and this is about the Prophet Muhammad. Escaping violent persecution in Mecca, the Prophet Muhammad and his first followers, who became known as al-Muhajirin, or migrants, found sanctuary in Medina, Western Arabia. This flight to refuge is known as the Hijra. And 622 CE, the year of their flight, marks the beginning of the Muslim calendar. So Muhammad and his followers found welcome and refuge and safety in Medina. And that's where they were able to develop the religion and accumulate more followers. The next story is from medieval England. We're jumping up to 1477. In July 1477, Christopher Brown, quote, insulted one Thomas Carter, who was riding and holding in front of him his little boy of 3 years of age. Whereupon the said Thomas, hastily dismounting on account of the insult, suffered his son to fall on the ground, and the horse, by an unfortunate accident, set its feet upon the child, who died within 2 hours from the wounds. Christopher, recognizing that he was the indirect cause of the child's death, hastened to Durham Cathedral, and that's where Christopher sought sanctuary. So in the 15th century, and well before in England, if you were running away from some trouble, if you were accused of a crime, for example, you would go to a religious house of some kind, or a church or a cathedral, and they would take you in. However, there were always limitations placed on how long people could stay there and what sort of people could stay there, and if they could leave, when during the day or night they could leave. So one example of a church sanctuary in England is Westminster Abbey. If you go to Westminster Abbey today, you will see a plaque that says sanctuary on it. And this is the cathedral close, and you walk in under an archway, and this is considered to be a sanctuary, a sacred place. And many people sought sanctuary in Westminster Abbey and its environs. And they could stay there indefinitely. This was one of the few places in England where people could gain indefinite sanctuary. But over the years, it got a very bad reputation because professional criminals would live there. And they would go out at night and commit crimes and then come back in the small hours of the morning, and nobody could go after them once they set foot on the cathedral grounds. So in that way, sanctuary became discredited over time in England and other then Catholic countries. Sanctuary was actually banned by the British Parliament in 1624 during the reign of James I, because rulers found that sanctuary prevented them from controlling the population, and it enabled dissenters or opponents to escape from them. So it fell out of the law in the 17th century. However, sanctuary did not stop just because of that. Here's another one. This is a little later, 1521. In 1521, the Elector of Saxony in Germany, a secular ruler, gave sanctuary to Martin Luther in Wartburg Castle. The Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, had declared Luther an outlaw, made it a crime to give him food or shelter, and called for him to be killed because of his heretical pronouncements. With the long-term support of the Elector and other political leaders, Luther survived and flourished, unlike Jan Hus, Giordano Bruno, and other religious reformers who lacked such protection. So you can see the institution of sanctuary continuing by secular authorities, even though it had fallen out of the law in many places. It continued in America, in the British colonies, for example. In the 1660s, 2 officers from Cromwell's army, who were members of the court that had condemned King Charles I to death 15 years before, arrived in the New Haven colony in Connecticut. They were fleeing indictments handed down under Charles II, who sent officers to the colony to arrest the 2 and return them to England for trial. A pastor in New Haven preached a sermon to the officers in support of sanctuary, and the Puritans hid the fugitives in a cave. The 2 stayed in the New Haven colony for 10 years before they died of natural causes. So this was effectively giving them sanctuary from the British ruler, who didn't have any success in getting his officials to enforce British law in the colonies. Here's another example, very different example of sanctuary in America. This also is in the 17th century. After their rebellion against the Spanish in the 1680s, the Tuwa people of Arizona fled west and sought refuge with the Hopi. The Hopi gave sanctuary to Lagunas, Acamas, and other Pueblo people fleeing Spanish authority. At around the same time, William Penn gave sanctuary in the Quaker colony of Pennsylvania to indigenous people who were fleeing conflict with other indigenous groups. The Quakers were very famous for treating indigenous people as equals and giving them protection when they needed it in the early years of Pennsylvania. In the 18th century, the Seneca indigenous people of New York gave temporary or permanent sanctuary to indigenous people of diverse origins. So it could be said that sanctuary is universal among humans. I found examples of sanctuary in hundreds of cultures and societies around the world at different time periods. Here's a 19th century. Oh, it seems to be moving. How about that? So here's a very ancient example of sanctuary in the Temple of Athena at Delphi. There's a medieval example, Durham Cathedral, mentioned earlier in England. I'll come back to this all later. So in the 19th century, Harriet Beecher Stowe lived in Cincinnati, Ohio, and she hid fugitive slaves in her home. She based the character of Eliza in her novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, on a woman who escaped across the partly frozen Ohio River in 1838 with her baby in her arms. After collapsing on the riverbank, this woman was discovered by a slave catcher who had watched her make her way across the river. He directed her to the home of Reverend John Rankin, who lived at the top of the hill. Rankin was, like Harriet Beecher Stowe, a conductor on the Underground Railroad. And Rankin sent her to the next Underground Railroad station without even learning her name. A few years later, Levi Coffin, who was a well-known Quaker conductor on the Underground Railroad, sent her north to Canada. Coffin, Rankin, and others hid and assisted thousands of escaping slaves during the 60-year life of the Underground Railroad. That's between around 1800 and 1860. If you want to know more about these stories and the history behind them, I recommend my book, Sanctuary and Asylum, A Social and Political History, which goes into considerable detail about this very complex and ancient institution. This story from the 20th century is a particular favorite of mine. It's the story of a Holocaust rescuer. In 1943, 4 Germans and a Dutch Nazi policeman raided a house outside Amsterdam, where Marion van Binsbergen had been hiding 4 Jews, Freddie Pollock and his 3 young children aged 1 to 5. She'd been hiding them for a year. The raiders did not find the hiding place under the living room floorboards where the frightened fugitives were hiding. The searchers left, but Marion knew from experience that sometimes they would return when the hidden people came out of their hiding place. So she cautioned the fugitives to stay put a while longer. But then the baby started to cry, so the children were let out. At this point, the Dutch policeman showed up again. He'd caught them. Marion, under the pretext of getting a comb, moved over to a chest in the room. In the drawer was a revolver that a friend had given her. Much later, she said, "I felt I had no choice except to kill him. I would do it again under the same circumstances, but it still bothers me, and I still feel that there should have been another way." She then alerted a Jewish ballet dancer that she knew, and he lived on the outside under a false identity. He found an undertaker who agreed to bury the body of the policeman in a coffin together with somebody who had died a natural death. So the Jewish family was kept safe and secure. And this was one of many rescues by Marion van Binsbergen, who at the time was 22 years old. This story comes from a pretty amazing book called The Righteous Among the Nations, Rescuers of Jews During the Holocaust. A more recent example comes from the sanctuary movement in the United States in the 1980s. In 1985, Chestnut Hill Quaker Meeting in Philadelphia gave sanctuary to an 18-year-old Salvadoran woman who called herself Paz. A member of the meeting named Karen stayed overnight in the meeting house office with Paz several times, and they would sleep on cots. One night, Karen thought she heard sounds in the meeting house. A young man had climbed through a bathroom window, perhaps with burglary in mind. Karen went out in the hallway and shouted, "What the hell do you think you're doing? Get out of here!" And he did. Karen called her husband, and they took Paz to their home for the night. Chestnut Hill Friends sheltered Paz for more than a year. Eventually, she married a British journalist and lived in the UK for a while. In 2001, she sent photos of herself, her husband, and their little boy from Sao Paulo, Brazil, where her husband was working as a journalist. A few years ago, after the new meeting house was built, members of the meeting were cleaning out the office in the old building. They found a scrapbook containing newspaper clippings, brochures, event announcements, financial reports, and other materials about Paz's stay at the meeting house. In the back of the scrapbook were tucked the photos of Paz and her family. Here's a story from the new sanctuary movement. The sanctuary movement of the 1980s pretty much ended around 1990 or so. And this was because a new administration that came into office in 1988 changed US policy toward Central America and made it a little bit easier for Central Americans to gain asylum in the United States. They also, the Congress passed temporary protected status at around that time. And the first people to gain temporary protected status in the United States in the early 90s were Salvadorans, and some of them are living in Takoma Park to this day. One of them was the founder of Casa de Maryland. So pretty much the movement petered out, although there were still people who continued to give refuge to migrants who would come to the door, and they would be welcomed, no questions asked. In 2008 and 2014, I went to Tucson to try and find out what was going on with the new sanctuary movement in Tucson, which is where the original sanctuary movement had started. And I went to a church called Southside Presbyterian Church. This is where the 1980s sanctuary movement was launched. And in 2014, when I went there, a woman named Rosa Robles Loreto, an undocumented Mexican woman with no criminal record, was working and living peacefully in Tucson with her husband and 2 children. But then one day, the police pulled her over for a minor traffic violation. Then ICE issued a deportation order for her. Sound familiar? So she sought sanctuary in Southside Presbyterian Church. She stayed in a small room, and she had daily visits from her family for more than a year. She was one of about a dozen undocumented people who found sanctuary in churches around the country in 2014. In late 2015, her pro bono lawyer obtained a stay of deportation, and Rosa returned home to her family in Tucson to wait for the resolution of her case. However, under the Trump administration, Rosa has not been able to adjust her status. So she once again is vulnerable to deportation. Sanctuary stories are often incomplete, and permanent sanctuary can be elusive, as it has been for Rosa. And in this, these slides, you'll see a picture of her. This is from the 1980s sanctuary movement. This was the border fence. It actually comes to an end in many places. It's very weird. But there are sensors implanted in the ground. So when people walk on those sensors, very soon the Border Patrol comes along and picks them up. This is somewhere in Eastern Europe, where Syrians and Afghans and Iraqis were trying to get to Germany. Let's see. I think if we keep going. If you look carefully, you can see the little girl's fingers behind her big sister. She was too shy to come out and have her picture taken. Here's another recent example of sanctuary being given to Indonesian Christians in a Reformed church in New Jersey. And this is Rosa in sanctuary in Tucson in 2014. So we're coming to the final stories. This is another new sanctuary movement story that's very recent. Some of you may have read about this in the Washington Post in recent weeks. A young man named Prince, that's his first name, Bohutu, came to the United States from Central African Republic as an adolescent with his parents in 2006. His father, who was a diplomat, applied for asylum, but for some reason did not receive asylum in 2011. So his parents had to return to Central African Republic in 2012. Shortly thereafter, his mother was murdered, and his father died soon after that. Prince apparently was able to stay in the United States. He went to high school in PG County, and he married his high school sweetheart. In 2017, his wife applied for his status to be regularized as the spouse of a US citizen. This process was still going on when ICE decided to deport Prince in April 2018, just a couple of months ago. Without notifying his wife or his lawyer, ICE sent Prince to JFK Airport on May 24th for deportation, just a couple of weeks ago. But Prince decided he wasn't going to go quietly. He was handcuffed and shackled, but he refused to leave the van that took him to the airport. So ICE agents were seen beating him with nightsticks and trying to drag him on board the plane. As a result of his loud protests, a flight attendant notified the captain. A captain of an airplane does not have to let anybody on the plane that he doesn't want to take. So this captain said, "I'm not giving permission for him to be on my plane." So Prince was returned to detention in Maryland. He is now in a detention center. I believe it's a local jail in Frederick, Maryland. And yesterday there was a vigil outside that detention center on behalf of Prince. Maybe ICE thought that nobody would care about the fate of a young man from a shithole country, as Donald Trump has called places like the Central African Republic. And I might add, the reason why people flee from places like that is because they're shithole countries, and nobody would want to live there if they could get away. But Prince has the vocal support of his community. Maryland senators, particularly Senator Van Hollen, wrote a very eloquent letter to Immigration and Customs Enforcement and Department of Homeland Security on behalf of Prince, asking them to release him immediately. And his Congress member has also written a similar letter. So it's possible that the support of his community, his senators, and his Congress member will save his life. Too early to know. But this does show that when people show their support for their neighbors who happen to be undocumented, or they may be seeking asylum, or they may be appealing unfavorable asylum decisions, or they may be undocumented, sometimes ICE and DHS feel pressured to back off, at least temporarily. There are many similar stories that are appearing right now. I'm on several websites where I get these stories almost every day. There's an organization called Detention Watch Network, which is active all over the United States. And if you're interested, you can sign up for this listserv and get lots of information about the situation of people who, as far as I'm concerned, are being persecuted by the Trump administration, which is waging a concerted, systematic attack not only on undocumented people, but on people with temporary protected status, on refugees by refusing to admit them, on asylum seekers by refusing them to even to apply for asylum, and on the immigration system as a whole. I believe they are trying to destroy the immigration system. And I think we as citizens have a moral responsibility to point out that we have obligations under US law and international law to help such people. And there are very complicated laws that provide for cases to be decided on an individual basis for people who are trying to stay in the United States. So these are the sanctuary stories that I thought would be interesting to tell, but I'm going to hand things over to my friend Kadist. Kadist is from Ethiopia, and did you come about 1.5 years ago? And so Kadist is going to tell you how she found refuge in the United States. So take it away, Kadist.
Thank you. Thank you, Linda. Good evening. My name is Kadist. I am from Ethiopia. And to begin with my story, I was a founder of a non-profit organization in Ethiopia. It's because of HIV and AIDS. I started to support people living with HIV and children who lost their parents with HIV. So I started a non-profit organization in my living room with my own resources. And I worked as an executive director for 11 years. And we supported over 50,000 individuals by fighting HIV/AIDS, women economic empowerment programs, building schools, libraries, and water points. So I was selected as one of African women non-profit leaders and invited to deliver a speech in Canada. I came to Canada in 2016 and delivered my speech, and I came to visit my brother in Dallas. And I came here to just to deliver my speech and go back to my country. But I was working also as a board member for Transparency International, and we were fighting corruption in Ethiopia. So while I was here, the government interfered with the organization, and it became unsafe to go back to my country. So I stayed here and asked asylum. In fact, it took me 4 months to decide to stay here and ask asylum, because I have an organization there, I have a family, I have a house, a car, and neighbors, friends, relatives, everything. So it was difficult to decide to be asylum seeker, but I was forced to do that, and I stayed here. After asked asylum, it was very difficult. We cannot work because we don't have work permit. For 6 months, 7 months, I didn't work. And there are so many issues like health issues. We don't have insurance. Living places, it's difficult to live with friends or something. The health issue, the economically, transportation, telephone, and other issues was also very difficult, especially thinking about home, thinking about children, about neighbors. It was very, very uncomfortable. And while I was here around Takoma Park, I met Linda. I think it's here in this place. So they have a meeting. They were talking about Syrian refugees, and I heard all the stories, and at the end I asked Linda, it's good to support Syrian refugees, but also there are asylum seekers and refugees in this area. Like me, I'm an asylum seeker. I have a problem, health problem, and all the things I told her. So then she started to find medical service, a living place, and also some support in different kinds. Thanks to Linda and her friends and the community, the Takoma community, I got support. I got health service, a living place, and people that are willing to do my resume, to edit my resume, and my resume was done very in a smart way, and they started to apply in different organizations, and my assumption was that I can get a job easily because my background is I have accounting bachelor's degree, and I have executive director work experience over 10 years. So I thought I can easily manage to get a job here in the US. But it didn't work. It took me 1 year to get a permanent job, thanks to different individuals, and I got a permanent job in last December 2017. And now I am working as a project coordinator for Easter Seals. It's an organization working for disabled children and seniors. So that's my story in brief. I would like to thank people that are supporting asylum seekers and refugees, because we have so many needs. We have financial needs, we have moral needs, we have different needs, and we need people. We need people to talk to us, to say that we are here to support you. So again, I would like to thank Linda and her friends and the whole Takoma Park people, those who supported me and those who are supporting refugees and asylum seekers. Thank you.
Okay. I think we can open this up for questions or comments, if people have any. Yeah?
I have a comment and a question. My husband and I were with the rally on behalf of Prince in Baltimore last week. Were you there?
No.
In front of ICE headquarters. There was about 70 interfaith people, and it was really good. It was really strong, and they eventually let in a few people, a small delegation inside the building where they delivered a petition on behalf of him. My question, and the vigil actually in Frederick is going to be tomorrow night at 7.
Okay.
My question is, as far as churches being sanctuary today, are people legally protected when they're in a church, or is it just a custom?
Interesting question. ICE has a policy, it's called the Sensitive Locations Policy. And it's basically been in effect for the last 30 years. So during the whole sanctuary movement of the 1980s, churches were never raided that were actually giving refuge to Central Americans. And in recent years, the policy has been expanded to cover schools, hospitals, cemeteries. It doesn't cover places like courthouses. So ICE has actually gone into courthouses and taken people out of courthouses and detained them. There are many defense lawyers, public defenders, and even judges who are protesting this. They say this absolutely should not be happening. So you won't find sanctuary in the law. So if you look for it in common law in the United States, it's not there. So if you ask a lawyer about it, he'll say, it has no legal meaning. This always annoys me, because that misses the point. Sanctuary is a predominantly religious institution. So it often takes place outside the law, or against the law, or running parallel to the law. But it doesn't have any legal weight in itself. So when the US government decided to prosecute some of the leaders of the sanctuary movement in 1985, they prosecuted 13 people. They prosecuted them for harboring and for smuggling. And these are federal crimes that have 7-year prison sentences. Many of the defendants were religious people. So there was a Presbyterian pastor, the pastor of Southside Presbyterian at the time, a Catholic priest, and a Quaker rancher who was a very influential theologian and theoretician of the sanctuary movement. So they were prosecuted for those crimes. And they were not allowed to present any evidence of the reasons why they had brought people across the border to safety. And the judge basically instructed the jury to convict them. So the jury felt like they had to follow the judge's instructions. Then the judge called the defendants into his chambers and he said, I don't want to make martyrs out of you, so I want you to sign a statement that you will cease and desist from these illegal activities. And they all said, well, sorry, we're not going to do that. You're just going to have to send us to jail. We're ready. So the judge threw up his hands and said, oh, all right. And he didn't make them sign such a statement. And they were all put on probation. There were a couple of them who were later arrested because they continued their activities and they were thereby violating the conditions of probation. And so one of them was sentenced to, I think it was 6 months in jail while she was pregnant. And from time to time, the federal government has gone after people. So for example, there are a couple of groups, they take water out to the Sonora Desert outside Tucson. And from time to time, the government will prosecute them under a federal anti-littering statute. And this is just really harassment. There's also a group that has a mobile clinic out in the desert. And that clinic, some months ago, was raided by ICE. And I believe the people who were running the clinic were arrested, but I don't know what's happened with their case. It might not even have gone to trial yet. This policy, this sensitive locations policy, could be stopped at any time. The Trump administration basically has no respect for the rule of law and does whatever it wants to do, and he thinks he can rule by decree by signing these executive orders, which judges left and right are striking down. So it's a very unsettled situation, and nobody really is sure what's going to happen. To my knowledge, there are churches and synagogues and other houses of worship that are giving physical sanctuary to people. I don't know how many in the United States right now. There are many more houses of worship that are engaging in sanctuary activities, support activities. And I don't think anybody has been prosecuted for those yet. Could happen.
Thank you.
Anybody else have any questions? You were nodding when I was talking about some recent developments. Have you been involved in stuff going on in Tucson?
No, just reading the Washington Post.
Uh-huh.
But I was also thinking of when you were talking about late 2017 case where there was a child who was born with a chronic condition that required medical care that you can only receive in the U.S. and not in her home country. And I think she and her parents were detained as they were taking her from her home to her hospital for some of the routine treatment that she needs because of her condition.
Essentially, the ICE abducted her, and they did take the child to the hospital, but they took the parents into custody.
So they get around the hospital ban by getting them on the highway on the way to the hospital.
And people, adults walking their children to school have been detained. People's homes have been raided, and often under false pretenses. In order to arrest somebody and put them in detention, ICE is supposed to have a judge's warrant. So it's a warrant signed by a judge, and it's in somebody's name. You can't just have a warrant without a name on it. That's blatantly unconstitutional. But what ICE does is they have these fake warrants, and they are not signed by a judge. They're merely signed by the head of the local ICE office. That is not a legal search warrant. It's not a legal arrest warrant. And they will go into somebody's house, and they often come at dawn when people are clearly not expecting them, and they may yell police, which is also, they're not really police. And they may be able to raid a place, force their way into somebody's home. And they often, they wave this piece of paper around, and then they may take other people in the home into custody without any warrant. And again, this is illegal, and it's been contested all over the place. But ICE has been a rogue agency for a long time. Before it was called ICE, when it was called Immigration and Naturalization Service, there were many, many court cases going back 20 years, 30 years of abuses and illegal actions. And they would go to the courts, sometimes all the way to the Supreme Court, and the judges would hand down binding decisions, and the immigration agency would just ignore them. And it continues to do that now. They think now, with the authority of Trump's executive orders and also certain orders that are coming out of Homeland Security and the Justice Department. But again, these are being contested in the courts. In the meantime, however, many people are suffering. People are being kept in inhumane conditions. People are dying in custody. People are being deported. They make mistakes. From time to time, they deport US citizens. So there are many, many abuses of the system that are going on. And what I always say to people is that these acts are illegal both under US law and international law. And who are the enforcers of international law? You. So if these cases bother you, get in touch with your elected representatives. Go on these check-ins or vigils. Make yourself visible. As of today, you won't get arrested, but I can't guarantee what will happen in the future. People may have to start making some tough decisions if the government decides to really crack down even more than it already has. So thank you very much for coming and making this a successful talk. If anybody has questions about these pictures, I'm happy to answer them. This is, there's one thing on the screen here and another thing here. But the book is Sanctuary and Asylum, a Social and Political History. Unfortunately, I didn't bring the pretty postcard that gives you a 30% discount, but I believe it's in the Takoma Park Library. Thank you.